Hi everybody, and welcome to a special bonus episode of Lexitecture. This episode is an outtake, as it happens, from an earlier recording session that Amy and I did, and we decided that it was interesting enough that we wanted to put it out in some format. And this year we're going to be doing a little more work on our Patreon page, putting up bonus episodes like this, or just one-off mini episodes where one of us just tackles sort of a word that maybe doesn't have quite as much as we would like to have in a regular episode, but we still think is interesting enough to talk about. And so those are going to go up on our Patreon feed strictly for our Patreon sponsors, of which we have one now, but hope springs eternal. If you would like to support the word work that we do and get bonus content like this one, you can head over to patreon.com/lextecture and sign up as one of our supporters. It doesn't matter how much you support us for. We would just be extremely grateful for the help and the show of support and the show of solidarity with us, no matter what that level you decide to give is. So anyway, on with this bonus episode. We hope you like it. As always, you can drop us a line at words@lexitecture.com, and you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter at Lexitecture. So without further ado, today's bonus episode, Niggardly. I had a friend of mine text me the other day because he's running into resistance when he uses the word niggardly.
Okay.
Niggardly, which basically just means cheap. Like, it just means overly frugal and miserly and stuff.
Yeah. I'm familiar with the word.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing whatsoever, etymologically or otherwise, to do with the racial epithet with which it bears a certain phonetic resemblance. But the phonetic resemblance is strong enough that it sort of, people kind of hear it and automatically bristle and become agitated. And
it's so interesting, isn't it, that words can be so charged. You know, if niggardly had a phonetic resemblance to a word that meant small cupboard, no one would care.
No, it wouldn't matter at all.
But of course, the fact that individual words can take on such layers upon layers upon layers of history and context and meaning and offence and pain and just, it's one of the reasons why language is so fantastically, endlessly interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And also one of the reasons I think why it's so important to learn about it, because the wrong word in the wrong place can be way more
really
troublesome.
Yeah.
And
he was like wondering about this and saying, like, is this my problem or is this my audience's problem? Like, when I'm speaking to people and they get upset about this. And I was like, well, I mean, technically speaking, you're completely right. There's no connection. There's nothing to do with it. It doesn't, sure, you're completely in the right. They're just misunderstanding you. But eventually that does sort of circle back to you because if you're using a word that is being misunderstood to the point where it is causing social problems and anxiety, and then at what point does the technical correctness and innocence of what you're saying give way to the effect of that word? And I think it's a really interesting question, is how
absolutely
how to walk that line. I remember, and it's not new either. I think I was in high school, so 700 million years ago. There was a mayor, I think, in Cincinnati, which was a city 700 million years ago still, who got into a big thing. Like, I mean, he was an American mayor, and we were hearing about him in Ontario, because he had used the word niggardly, and people lost their minds.
Wow.
And it became this big scandal, and he was like sitting there going, what? No, I didn't say that's no. Guys, here's the word, here's the definition, nothing. So it's not a new phenomenon, but it's just interesting to think about at what point, if ever, do the potency of one word sort of spills over and you say, all right, we'll kind of relegate this other one to the dustbin, because there are perfectly acceptable, accurate, and just equally effective. Like, I like miserly personally, but So at what point do you say, yeah, we should probably give this one a pass as well?
It's fascinating, right? It's a really brilliant issue to consider. What I'm just thinking about is how ironic it is that there are in fact so many words with truly horrendous etymologies that we use, and it's no big thing. So I suppose it really depends on the level of the education of the audience, and I don't mean that as a kind of a condescending, I'm more educated than somebody else kind of way. I mean that, you know, if you are if you happen to know the super duper complicated and intricate etymologies of several thousand words, and you point out to someone that I'm of course I'm trying to think of an example and I'm coming up empty here, but you know, well, to take some of the words that we've discussed that have very quickly been related to colonialism, in some way, shape or form. Is colonialism offensive? I would say so.
Yeah.
You know, but it depends on your knowledge of that word and its particular meaning, your particular take experiences, and in a lot of cases ancestry when it comes to colonialism. Do you find that offensive? Do you not find that offensive? So yeah, I agree. I think you're right. I think that I would come back to, and this was always my kind of last word on it when I was a school teacher and kids would ask me hard questions, hard social questions about language. Context is everything.
Mm-hmm.
But audience, I think, has to be something.
Yeah, and I think the audience is part of the context.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm
In usage.
I'm not sure how I feel about Niggardly. I'm not sure how I feel about what you're talking about. Because yeah, that notion of, I mean, it's a vastly different situation. However, I feel as though being forced to shelve a word which I know is not offensive or related to a racial epithet feels unfair in the same way that it feels unfair to say to young girls, you shouldn't wear that because it's revealing. And while, you know, that is a complicated and far-reaching debate, and one of my friends accompanied a school trip, a group of teenagers. They went on a trip to France, and she had quite a difficult time explaining to these teenagers when they got to the part of their trip that took in Paris. Firstly, that there was an appropriate and an inappropriate way to dress to visit Notre Dame. And secondly, why one does not always wear exactly what one likes. And her take on it, I always find very, it's interesting. It's a good take, I think. And what she said was, girls, you're right. You should be able to wear whatever you like without inviting any unwanted sexual attention. You should. That should be the world that we live in. However, right now, it is not. This is not the world that we live in. And you can wear what you want. However, you must also be aware that you will attract perhaps unwanted attention. Perhaps wanted attention. You know, it's and so it does, you come back to the sense of context is very important. But the point at which someone says to you, you can't do that thing when you feel like you're not doing anything wrong, that's a really interesting space, I think. It's an interesting emotional space to work in. And it's hard to have a clear and definitive answer about what you should do and how you should feel.
It's an odd... Yeah, it's...
Language is the story of being alive, you know? Yeah.
I've just looked up...
And I think that... Sorry, on you go.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, you know, the fact that language is the story of being alive, language needs to reflect the same difficulties and the incredibly pitfall-laden nature of trying to be a good human being.
I've just looked up Niggardly because we've been talking about it and it sort of showed up. But it's and I'm online as mean person or miser, late 14th century Nygart, Nygart, and
Okay.
of uncertain origin. Suffix suggests French origin. Root is possibly from earlier Nig, stingy, sort of circa 1300s. Related to Old Norse, which I'm not even going to try to... HNO with a slash through it, GGR. Stingy, from a Proto-Germanic word that even makes less sense to me. It looks like the best Scrabble word that could never possibly exist in English, because it's KHNAUWJAZ, from which the Swedish get the word NJUGG, njug, maybe? Which is close or careful, and the German genau, precise and exact. So yeah, nothing to do with, for once, a word that is negative but doesn't have to do with colonialism or putting someone down or, race. Or based on a race. Or...
Yeah. I mean, I'm pretty sure, given the kind of raping, looting, pillaging reputation that they have, that the Norsemen were pretty racist by most kind of definitions of racist. If every time you encounter someone who comes from a different race to you, you conquer them or kill them, I think that makes you reasonably racist. However, it does not in any way relate to a racial epithet or skin-coloured put-down. Yeah.
That's very interesting.
Very interesting.
Anyway, this will probably become a one-off half episode to save up for at some point, but
I think, I think that perhaps having had the upbringing that I've had and where I've had it, the N-word isn't a word that I have ever heard anyone use in common parlance. It's not a word that I would have been exposed to through general participation in society, where I live and where I was brought up. And I'm thinking about I'm thinking about teaching of Mice and Men, as I used to when I was an English teacher, because it's one of the most wonderful pieces of literature. I absolutely adore Of Mice and Men. And Of Mice and Men describes Crooks, the black slave-like character on the ranch. And always the conversation would come up amongst teachers. When we read the word, do we read the word or do we bowdlerise it in some way? And yeah, I used to read the word, and then I would use the shock that came from that was generally generated by a teacher of all people saying such a thing aloud, to then lead the discussion of why that word is so charged and so difficult to negotiate. And if ever there was an argument for retiring a word, I think that would be a pretty good candidate.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's why it's sort of generally become, with a few exceptions, like just accepted that that's just the way it kind of goes. But
yeah, well, both of us are a little bit afraid of using it in this podcast.
Yeah, I'm not going to.
yeah, I'm not going to either.
So it's interesting that it's reached that point.
Yeah, I'm interested in my own feelings about it as I'm talking about it. But yeah, there are few other words about which I feel quite as strongly that no one should ever use that word.
Yeah, I can't readily think of another one.
I can think of a couple.
I think
yeah.
There are contexts in which, like, I feel like there are a much larger circle, but still small circle of words that are very specifically cordoned off. And to be used with a heaping helping of caution and deference.
Yeah, for sure. To lighten the tone somewhat, if you were going to retire a word from the English language, what would it be? You can have a think about that and come back to me.
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting topic for conversation.
We'll have to at some point.
Right now, my top candidate would be Brexit.
I could see that.
Partly because I mean, I disagree with the political issue, but when that word first started to be used, it was ridiculous. It was ridiculous in the sense that it's an awful portmanteau word and it sounds ugly. And it was ridiculous that we even needed a word to describe this thing that was never going to happen.
Right, and then it became...
So, yes, interesting times. But there are lots of words that I would retire if I had the choice. Sometimes through nothing more than whimsy.
Yeah, I think there probably are some that I would come up with. I can't come up with any right now. My brain is reeling right now. But there are probably some that I would come up with purely based on the fact that I would prefer that people started using the more interesting alternative to them.
Oh, for sure. There's tons like that.
Like those... So basically just out of spite.
Yeah.
Which is quite the motivator. Not something to use in a job interview.
It always makes me think of, you were talking about using alternative words, always makes me think of when we lived in Korea and I had gone home for a couple of weeks over Christmas and New Year, and I was just back and it was probably like, I don't know, Friday, Saturday night, and I was kind of seeing who was around, was there anything going on, what were the plans, and you had texted me or I had texted you, and it was a pretty humdrum average text conversation, and then you texted me to say, while you were gone, there was no one else in town who would have used the word marvellous in a text message.
Yeah, no, that's true.
That may have been when this podcast was born.
Yeah, neither of us knew it at the time, but that's the origin story right there. Hi everybody, Ryan here after the fact. As I was going through this episode and putting the audio together, I decided I would look up in our old favorite Smith's Synonyms Discriminated, just to see if Smith had anything to say about the word niggardly, and sure enough, he did. The word is lumped in with other synonyms, as is the way this book is organized. The words that are grouped together are niggardly, miserly, avaricious, covetous, and sordid, which again, in similar fashion to other words we've looked up in Synonyms Discriminated, they're not words that we necessarily put together today. Sometimes we just don't use them anymore, like niggardly, and sometimes we just wouldn't necessarily put them together like miserly or covetous or sordid. But the opening paragraph of this section is, all these terms describe excess of selfishness in the use or acquisition of money or valuable possessions. The niggardly man is hard upon others, the miserly man upon himself as well. He lives only for the hoard. The avaricious is simply rapacious for himself. The covetous is so at the expense of others. The quality of the miser starving in the midst of plenty is more ridiculous than pitiable. That of the niggardly man the more pitiable and hateful, for he would profit, though others would starve. That of the avaricious and covetous the more formidable. Avarice is greediness, but covetousness would snatch the food from another's mouth. The avaricious man is a man of cares and desires, the covetous man one of envy and design. And so it's interesting to see, as always, how Smith discriminates between these synonyms, but it just gives an idea of a little bit of the nuance that used to exist in various ways to describe greedy people. So in case you listened to our conversation about the word and whether it ought to be retired, and we're thinking, I've never actually heard that word before, I wonder if there's anything else I can find out about. Well, Smith's Synonyms Discriminated to the rescue. So I hope you enjoyed this little bonus episode. We're going to hopefully have more of these that will be posted onto our Patreon page as patron-only posts, but we wanted to have this one out for you to see what kinds of things we were going to be putting onto our Patreon feed, and also just thought this was a good one to have as much conversation about as we possibly could. So hopefully we'll see you over on Patreon if you decide that this is something you'd like to support, and otherwise we'll see you on a regular feed, and we will talk to you again next time.